He was born in a Bedouin tent, came to power in a coup, and for more than 40 years, Muammar Gaddafi has stood as one of the most bizarre characters on the world stage.
He once ruled with an iron grip, lavish, feared, untouchable. For over 4 decades, Muammar Gaddafi built a fortress of power, crushing rebellion before it ever took root. But in the final stretch, everything unraveled. What happens when a man who saw himself as immortal is hunted, cornered, and dragged into the dirt? This isn't just the fall of a dictator. It's a raw, relentless collapse that few dared imagine. You've heard of regime change. You've seen revolutions. But nothing prepares you for what went down in those final hours. And a brutal end that's hard to forget, and even harder to stomach. The birth of the Jamahiriya. Muammar Gaddafi's ascent to power in 1969 marked a pivotal turning point in Libya's history. At just 27 years old, the young military officer led a group of fellow free officers in a bloodless coup against King Idris, who had ruled Libya since its independence. The king, elderly and in poor health, was abroad for medical treatment when Gaddafi and his allies seized control. Libya's monarchy was swiftly dismantled, and a new revolutionary government was declared. In a radio address following the coup, Gaddafi framed the takeover as a national awakening. "Your armed forces have toppled the reactionary, backward, and corrupt regime. Libya shall be free and sovereign." The coup was welcomed by many Libyans, especially younger generations and segments of the military, who viewed the king's regime as corrupt, ineffectual, and heavily influenced by Western powers. Immediately after taking power, Gaddafi moved to assert national sovereignty and erase colonial-era legacies. He expelled the remaining Italian settlers, ordered the closure of American and British military bases, and initiated the nationalization of Libya's oil industry, which until then had been dominated by foreign companies. These actions won him praise across the Arab world and among post-colonial nations, who saw in Gaddafi a strong leader rejecting imperial influence. He declared his allegiance to Arab nationalism and sought inspiration from Egyptian leader Gamal Abdel Nasser, adopting similar rhetoric and policies aimed at uniting the Arab world. By 1977, Gaddafi formalized his political vision into a system he called the Jamahiriya, or State of the Masses.
The Jamahiriya, or State of the Masses. This announcement created, at least in theory, the state envisioned by Gaddafi in his Green Book.
In theory, this system allowed ordinary citizens to govern themselves through local councils and people's committees. He insisted that his was not a dictatorship, saying, "I am not the leader of Libya, I am the leader of the revolution. I have done my best to make my people happy and free." He abolished formal government ministries and claimed that Libya had no president or head of state, only the people ruled. However, in practice, Gaddafi remained the uncontested center of power. He held no official title beyond brotherly leader and guide of the revolution, yet every major decision flowed through him or those loyal to him. Critics accused him of using the Jamahiriya to disguise autocracy behind revolutionary jargon. Gaddafi's control of Libya was not just political, it was deeply ideological. He published his political philosophy in a series of writings known as the Green Book, which blended Islamic thought, socialism, and populism into a unique but incoherent manifesto. Citizens were required to study it, and it became a central part of Libya's educational and media systems. The book rejected both capitalism and communism, positioning Gaddafi's ideas as a third alternative. Through this framework, he justified banning political parties, suppressing dissent, and instituting mass surveillance. Revolutionary committees, loyal to him alone, were established to monitor citizens and enforce ideological conformity. While Gaddafi promoted the image of a leader who had liberated Libya from monarchy and foreign interference, his rule quickly evolved into a highly centralized and repressive regime.
He said he thought outside powers wanted to recolonize Libya, and he vowed to fight off any invaders alongside the Libyan people.
Despite early popular support, Opposition voices were silenced, critics were imprisoned or executed, and entire families could be punished for dissent. His revolutionary vision became a tool for entrenching personal authority. Yet for decades, he successfully portrayed himself, especially to outside audiences, as the bold architect of a new political era in the Arab world, rooted in anti-imperialism, self-rule, and radical reform. The outlaw years. During the 1970s and 1980s, Muammar Gaddafi became one of the most controversial and widely condemned leaders on the global stage. His political ideology and international behavior earned him notoriety far beyond Libya's borders. Gaddafi championed a radical foreign policy that supported revolutionary and armed movements across the globe. From the Irish Republican Army, IRA, in Northern Ireland, to the African National Congress, ANC, in apartheid-era South Africa, he provided funding, weapons, and training to groups he deemed anti-imperialist. Gaddafi defended his support for these groups, stating during one speech, "We support freedom fighters, not terrorists. We help those resisting imperialism." He saw himself as a revolutionary hero, positioning Libya as a sanctuary for those fighting colonialism and Western domination. However, many countries viewed this as blatant sponsorship of terrorism. One of the most defining and damaging moments of Gaddafi's global image came with Libya's alleged involvement in high-profile terror attacks.
Protests broke out across the country after Libyans learned that British officials had considered using its bases in Libya to attack Egypt. Gaddafi likely applauded the riots and protests, believing that the nation was disentangling itself from the hold of Western powers.
In 1986, the U.S. accused Libyan agents of orchestrating the bombing of a Berlin nightclub frequented by American servicemen, slaying 3 people and injuring over 200. In retaliation, U.S. President Ronald Reagan ordered airstrikes on Tripoli and Benghazi in Operation El Dorado Canyon. The attack slayed dozens of people, including Gaddafi's adopted daughter, according to Libyan officials. But the most infamous incident tied to Libya occurred in 1988, when Pan Am Flight 103 exploded over Lockerbie, Scotland, slaying all 259 passengers and 11 people on the ground. In response to international condemnation, Gaddafi remained defiant. As he declared during a televised address in 2011, "Muammar Gaddafi is the leader of the revolution. I am not going to leave this land. I will die here as a martyr." Western governments, especially the US and the UK, blamed Libyan operatives for planting the bomb. The Lockerbie bombing led to some of the harshest consequences Libya had ever faced on the world stage. The United Nations imposed sweeping sanctions in the early 1990s, including a ban on air travel, arms sales, and diplomatic engagement. Libya's economy, heavily reliant on oil exports and international business, suffered greatly. Isolation turned Gaddafi into a pariah, with few allies beyond other authoritarian regimes and insurgent groups. His fiery speeches at international forums, full of conspiracy theories and anti-Western vitriol, only deepened his image as an unpredictable and dangerous figure. Some of his claims, such as blaming Western countries for inventing AIDS or earthquakes, were widely mocked and dismissed as rumors or propaganda. Despite the sanctions and condemnation, Gaddafi remained defiant. He continued to funnel resources into revolutionary causes abroad and tried to expand Libya's influence in Africa and the Middle East. He hosted summits in Tripoli for rebel leaders and demanded a single Arab or African state that he would help lead. His insistence on radical unity often clashed with the ambitions of other regional powers, particularly Egypt and Saudi Arabia, creating deep political rifts. While he proclaimed himself a champion of oppressed peoples, many neighboring leaders saw him as a destabilizing force with little regard for diplomacy. Throughout this era, Gaddafi cultivated a cult of personality at home and abroad. He wore elaborate military uniforms, traveled with a personal tent even on state visits, and surrounded himself with female bodyguards, which added to his mystique. But behind the theatrics was a man deeply invested in maintaining power through fear, propaganda, and confrontation. As international pressure mounted, Gaddafi doubled down rather than retreat, firmly entrenching Libya's place as an outcast nation under the weight of its leader's radical ambitions. Gaddafi's diplomatic comeback. By the early 2000s, Muammar Gaddafi began a calculated effort to rebrand himself in Libya on the world stage. After decades of international isolation, economic sanctions, and accusations of terrorism, Gaddafi appeared to pivot toward reconciliation with the West. This shift was partly driven by the toll sanctions had taken on Libya's economy, especially its vital oil sector. Gaddafi recognized that rebuilding Libya's global relationships was key to restoring trade, attracting foreign investment, and regaining legitimacy. His strategy was to present himself as a pragmatic statesman who had matured beyond his radical past. A major turning point came in 2003 when Libya voluntarily agreed to dismantle its weapons of mass destruction programs.
By December 2003, Libya had agreed to terminate its weapons of mass destruction program and allow inspectors into the state, while some American leaders, such as Secretary of State Colin Powell, gloated that Gaddafi had been cowed by the American invasion of Iraq and Afghanistan, a claim which Gaddafi furiously denied.
This included abandoning its nascent nuclear efforts, chemical weapons stockpiles, and long-range missile development.
First of all, this problem, we fixed it a while ago with Britain and America. We finished it. Is it even possible for a person to use chemical weapons against his own enemy in this modern age, let alone his own people?
Gaddafi used the shift as proof of Libya's exceptionalism. As he told an American audience in 2008, "There is no state with a democracy except Libya on the whole planet." The move surprised many observers and was widely interpreted as an effort to avoid the fate of Saddam Hussein, who had been ousted in Iraq that same year. Western governments, particularly the United States and United Kingdom, welcomed the decision and began restoring diplomatic ties. Gaddafi's Libya was removed from the U.S. list of state sponsors of terrorism in 2006, and embassies were reopened in both Tripoli and Washington. Simultaneously, Gaddafi positioned himself as a Pan-African leader and mediator. He redirected his focus from Arab nationalism to African unity, promoting ambitious ideas such as a United States of Africa. He hosted numerous African Union summits in Sirte, invested heavily in infrastructure projects across the continent, and offered financial support to struggling African nations. He also took on a more active role in regional conflict resolution, offering to mediate disputes and even brokering truces in civil wars. His influence in Africa grew, and he was eventually named the African Union chairman in 2009, a symbolic recognition of his efforts to reshape Libya's image from international rogue to continental leader. Despite this shift, many believed that Gaddafi's transformation was largely cosmetic. Still, Gaddafi portrayed his system as people-powered. The Libyan system is a system of the people, and no one can go against the authority of the people. The people are free to choose the authority they see fit. At home, Libya remained tightly controlled. Political dissent was still banned, and security services remained active in suppressing opposition. Though his rhetoric toward the West softened, his domestic policies remained authoritarian. Critics argued that his cooperation with Western powers was more about self-preservation than true reform. Nonetheless, the rebranding worked. Temporarily. Gaddafi shook hands with world leaders, met US and European officials, and even delivered speeches at the United Nations. For a time, he succeeded in recasting himself from feared strongman to eccentric elder statesman, all while retaining his grip on power. The seeds of revolt. Inside Libya, beneath the facade of reform and international diplomacy, dissatisfaction had been brewing for years. While Muammar Gaddafi presented himself abroad as a statesman, at home he ruled with an iron fist. Political parties were banned, opposition was criminalized, and a complex web of security agencies ensured strict control over the population. citizens could not freely criticize the government, and even casual remarks seen as disloyal could lead to detention or worse. The revolutionary committees, fiercely loyal to Gaddafi, acted as both enforcers of ideology and informants. Their reach extended into schools, universities, workplaces, and neighborhoods, making fear a part of daily life. Economic grievances added to the resentment. Libya, with one of the largest oil reserves in Africa, generated immense revenue from petroleum exports. However, much of this wealth never reached ordinary citizens. Corruption was rampant at every level of government, and a select elite, mostly comprised of Gaddafi's family, tribal allies, and military loyalists, controlled the bulk of the country's resources. Meanwhile, basic services like healthcare, housing, and education were inadequate for much of the population. Unemployment among youth was especially high, and frustration mounted as people watched members of the regime live in opulence while they struggled to make ends meet. One of the darkest stains on Gaddafi's domestic record was the 1996 Abu Salim prison massacre. That year, over 1,200 prisoners were slain inside the Tripoli-based prison after staging a protest against poor conditions. The massacre was carried out by security forces under the command of Gaddafi's regime, and the victims were mostly political prisoners and dissidents. For years, the Libyan government denied the scale of the slayings and refused to investigate or release information. Families of the victims, many of whom had no knowledge of their relatives' fates, were left in limbo. The incident became a powerful symbol of the regime's brutality and helped fuel long-term anger across the country. Reflecting on this moment of awakening, Libyan writer Ghazi Gablawi later said, "For the first time, people were publicly denouncing Gaddafi. Doing that had in itself become an act of liberation." By the late 2000s, small acts of resistance were becoming more visible. In cities like Benghazi and Misrata, people began to demand justice for the Abu Salim massacre and call for greater civil rights. Human rights activists, including lawyers like Fatih Terbil, took up the cause, organizing families and pushing for accountability. These efforts were often suppressed, but they planted seeds of dissent that would later explode into full-blown revolt. Condemning the regime's repression, UK Foreign Secretary William Hague remarked, "The violent conduct of the Libyan government is shocking and must be condemned in the strongest of terms." The authorities responded to these calls not with reform, but with surveillance, intimidation, and more arrests. All of this occurred against the backdrop of broader regional unrest. As neighboring Tunisia and Egypt saw popular uprisings topple their longtime leaders in early 2011, Libyans saw an opportunity. They were not simply inspired by their neighbors. They had their own long history of repression and injustice to rise against. Years of political exclusion, economic inequality, and brutal crackdowns had left the country on edge. What began as frustration quietly brewing in private homes and whispered conversations would soon erupt into one of the bloodiest uprisings of the Arab Spring. The uprising begins. The uprising in Libya began as a spark and rapidly ignited into a nationwide revolt. On February 15, 2011, protests broke out in the city of Benghazi following the arrest of human rights lawyer Fatih Terbil. He had been representing the families of the victims of the 1996 Abu Salim prison massacre, and his sudden detention triggered widespread outrage. That same day, family members and activists gathered outside a police station to demand his release. Their demonstration quickly drew in others who were angered not just by Terbil's arrest, but by decades of state oppression, censorship, and corruption under Muammar Gaddafi's rule. By February 17th, thousands of Libyans across Benghazi and other eastern cities joined in what became known as the Day of Rage. Protesters took to the streets in Tobruk, Derna, and Baida, voicing demands for political reform and an end to dictatorship. These demonstrations, inspired by the successful uprisings in Tunisia and Egypt, were largely peaceful at first. However, Gaddafi's government responded with overwhelming force.
No demonstration at all in the streets. No, no one against us. Against me for what? Because I am not president.
But then
They love me, all my people with me.
Security forces, including the notorious Internal Security Agency and revolutionary committees, opened fire on unarmed crowds. Hospitals reported hundreds of injuries and over 230 deaths within the first few days, many caused by bullets to the head and chest, indicating the use of live ammunition. The violent crackdown only galvanized more opposition. Instead of silencing the people, it enraged them. The use of snipers, rooftop gunmen, and random arrests turned the protests into a full-blown rebellion. State media attempted to blame foreign agents and anesthetized youths for the unrest, but few believed these claims. Gaddafi's son, Saif al-Islam, delivered a televised speech warning that the country would descend into civil war if the protests continued. British Prime Minister David Cameron responded firmly to the regime's threats. Colonel Gaddafi has made this happen. He has lied to the international community. He has broken that ceasefire. He threatened rivers of blood, a phrase that shocked many and confirmed to the public that the regime would not compromise. Rather than intimidating protesters, this rhetoric steeled their resolve. As momentum built, cracks in the regime began to show. Key military units started to defect, most notably in Benghazi, where elements of the Libyan army refused to fire on civilians. Major General Suleiman Mahmoud and the 36th Brigade abandoned the regime and joined the rebels, helping them seize control of large parts of the city. Police stations were overrun, weapons were looted, and government buildings were torched. Similar scenes played out in Misrata, Tobruk, and Zawiya. Protesters began to arm themselves with rifles and equipment taken from army depots, transforming demonstrations into an armed insurrection. NATO's air war and resolution 1973. As the Libyan uprising evolved into a civil war, international concern mounted over Muammar Gaddafi's increasingly violent tactics. By early March 2011, his forces were using tanks, artillery, and aircraft to retake cities that had fallen into rebel hands. In places like Ajdabiya and Benghazi, civilians were bombed and neighborhoods were reduced to rubble. International media circulated graphic footage of wounded children, destroyed homes, and overwhelmed hospitals. The fear that Gaddafi would launch a massive assault on Benghazi, Libya's second-largest city, and a rebel stronghold, raised alarms across the world. Many feared that without outside help, a massacre was imminent. In response, the Arab League held an emergency session on March 12th and issued a call for a no-fly zone over Libya. This support from Arab nations was crucial. It gave political cover for Western countries to act. France and the United Kingdom quickly pushed the United Nations to intervene. British Prime Minister David Cameron emphasized urgency before the strikes. There is still time for Colonel Gaddafi to avoid the worst. The door of international diplomacy will open again the moment attacks end. After tense negotiations, the UN Security Council passed Resolution 1973 on March 17, 2011. The resolution authorized the use of all necessary measures to protect civilians, including enforcing a no-fly zone and calling for an immediate ceasefire. It received 10 votes in favor, with 5 abstentions, including Russia and China. This resolution became the legal foundation for military intervention. Just 2 days later, on March 19th, coalition airstrikes began. The operation, named Operation Odyssey Dawn, was led by a coalition that included the United States, France, the UK, Canada, and Italy. Its first targets were Gaddafi's air defenses, radar installations, and military communication centers. Over 110 Tomahawk cruise missiles were launched from US and British warships. French fighter jets attacked tanks advancing toward Benghazi, helping halt a feared ground invasion. These strikes significantly damaged Gaddafi's ability to coordinate attacks and reassured rebel forces who had been bracing for total defeat. By March 23rd, NATO took over full control of the military operation, renaming it Operation Unified Protector. The mission expanded beyond just air defense to include arms embargo enforcement, air patrols, and close air support for rebel fighters. NATO's coalition grew to include 28 member states and several non-NATO partners, such as Qatar, Jordan, and the United Arab Emirates. NATO aircraft bombed Libya military infrastructure across the country. MiG-23s, rocket launchers, armored columns, and command centers were systematically targeted. Supply convoys were intercepted, and long-range artillery was destroyed. At sea, NATO warships patrolled the Libyan coast to prevent weapons shipments from reaching regime forces. The fall of Tripoli. By mid-2011, Muammar Gaddafi's grip on power was weakening rapidly. With NATO continuing its relentless air campaign and rebel groups gaining momentum on multiple fronts, the regime faced mounting pressure from all sides. As Gaddafi pleaded for resistance, he urged supporters in Tripoli to prepare for armed defense. Gaddafi declared, "Pick up your weapons. There should be no fear." The National Transitional Council, NTC, now widely recognized as Libya's legitimate government, coordinated an effort to launch a final blow against Gaddafi's stronghold, Tripoli. Rebel forces, which had previously been fragmented and limited in their reach, began uniting in strategy and advancing in a three-pronged assault from the west, east, and south. These coordinated efforts marked the beginning of Operation Mermaid Dawn, the final push to topple Gaddafi's rule. Launched on August 20, 2011, Operation Mermaid Dawn was not simply a military offensive, it was also a covert uprising. In the weeks leading up to the operation, rebel fighters had been secretly smuggled into Tripoli, blending into civilian areas and stockpiling weapons. These sleeper cells waited for the signal to rise up from within. When the operation began, these fighters launched attacks from inside the capital, targeting loyalist checkpoints and key infrastructure. At the same time, rebel forces from the Nafusa Mountains and coastal regions began closing in on Tripoli from the outside. The plan was to overwhelm Gaddafi's forces from all directions simultaneously. The fighting in Tripoli was intense and chaotic. Neighborhoods such as Fashloom, Tajura, and Souk al-Juma became battlegrounds as snipers, tanks, and machine guns were deployed by loyalist units to suppress the rebellion. But the tide turned quickly. Many Gaddafi soldiers surrendered or deserted their posts as rebel columns stormed into the city. Others fled as resistance collapsed faster than expected. The rapid pace of the assault caught the regime off guard. Communications were disrupted, and coordination among Gaddafi's units began to break down. Within 5 days, large swaths of the capital had fallen into rebel hands. On August 23rd, rebel fighters overran Bab al-Azizia, Gaddafi's infamous fortified compound in the heart of Tripoli. This sprawling complex had been the center of his rule for over 4 decades, equipped with bunkers, underground tunnels, and security walls. As rebels pushed through the gates, they found abandoned weapons, documents, and signs of a hasty escape. The fall of Bab al-Azizia was symbolic. It marked the unraveling of Gaddafi's reign in his own capital. But the man himself was nowhere to be found. Rumors swirled about his whereabouts, with some suggesting he had already fled the city before the assault began. Gaddafi's final hours. After the fall of Tripoli, Muammar Gaddafi retreated to the city of Sirte, his birthplace and final stronghold. Though most of the country had slipped from his control, Gaddafi refused to surrender or flee abroad. He saw leaving Libya as a humiliation, and instead chose to make a last stand in the city he had personally developed and elevated during his rule. Sirte held deep personal significance for him. It was not only where he was born, but also where he had hosted summits, built infrastructure, and envisioned as the capital of a United States of Africa. Now it became the stage for the regime's last and most desperate defense. By early September 2011, the National Transitional Council, NTC, had begun moving thousands of fighters towards Sirte. Rebel brigades from Misrata, Benghazi, Zintan, and the Nafusa Mountains converged on the city, aiming to capture Gaddafi and eliminate any remaining loyalist resistance. The rebels expected a swift victory, but the battle proved far more difficult than anticipated. Loyalist fighters, many from Gaddafi's own tribe, the Qaddafi, had entrenched themselves throughout Sirte. They used civilian buildings as cover, planted landmines, and turned homes, schools, and even hospitals into sniper positions. Progress for the NTC was slow and bloody, with intense street battles and heavy casualties on both sides. Inside the besieged city, Gaddafi lived in constant movement. Alongside a shrinking circle of loyalists, including his son Mutassim and Defense Minister Abu Bakr Yunus Jabr, he shifted between abandoned houses and underground bunkers to avoid detection. Communications were limited. The group relied on human messengers instead of phones to evade NATO surveillance. They endured severe shortages. Water and electricity were cut off, medical supplies were scarce, and many fighters were wounded and malnourished. Gaddafi's health reportedly deteriorated. Rumors circulated that he suffered from high blood pressure, weight loss, and stress-related conditions, though he remained defiant and refused to abandon his post. As the siege tightened, escape attempts became more urgent. On October 19th, Gaddafi and his inner circle formed a convoy of over 50 vehicles in a final bid to flee south towards Sabha, with hopes of eventually crossing into Niger or Algeria. They departed under cover of darkness, hoping to slip past rebel checkpoints and NATO surveillance. But NATO drones had been monitoring Sirte and detected the movement. At dawn on October 20th, a U.S. Predator drone fired a missile at the front of the convoy, and shortly after, French Mirage jets bombed the rear. The attack destroyed several vehicles and scattered the survivors into the surrounding area. Thanks for watching the brutal last hours of Gaddafi. If this left you speechless or stirred any thoughts, hit that like button and let us know what you think in the comments. Don't forget to subscribe for more intense deep dives into untold moments in history. And if you're ready for another story that'll keep you on the edge, click on the next video now showing on your screen.